Good morning, class, and welcome to our second screencast on Chapter 19, focusing on the West after the Civil War. And today's topic is going to be life on the reservations, what it was like, and why the Indians were not assimilated into Western society, but they were segregated off on these reservations. Now, a reservation is really kind of an interesting concept within America, and it's kind of a unique thing to America. And so, if you take a look here at what a reservation is. If you look out in the western, for the most part, all of those dark areas are showing you reservations in the United States today. And if you notice, basically all of them, there are small ones in the east, very small ones, but almost all of them are out west. And so you have some pretty big ones out west because that's primarily where all of the Indians were being pushed, as we talked about in our last screencast. Now, what exactly is a reservation is a pretty interesting concept. A reservation is what you would call a domestic dependent nation. So what that means is that in some ways it's a sovereign nation, as in some of the laws of the United States do not apply there. And that's why you will see things on reservations like uh, casinos and making cigarettes and things like that, because a lot of the laws of the United States do not apply on reservations. But they're also not entirely an independent nation. They're not entirely a sovereign nation either. They're what you will call a domestic dependent nation, meaning, these Indian reservations, they're not going to declare war on the United States. They kind of recognize through this that they are dependent on the United States, although in some ways they retain their sovereignty. So it's kind of an interesting and unique thing that develops in the United States. Now, if you look out west, we often think of, at this time period, kind of segregation as far as the South and Jim Crow laws in the South. But really in the West, this is their own form of segregation here. You really don't have a black community out in the West. And the minority group are American Indians at this time. And even today you still have large populations of Native Americans in certain places. Now they're segregated in very different ways than the black people in the South are segregated. They're going to be segregated off on these reservations, partially because they want to be, as far as separated into their own nation, but they wanted to retain their full land and their full rights. They didn't want to be kind of stuck in these confines of this area. And so if you look here, some of the really dark green areas are showing you reservations that have basically 60% or higher American Indian population. And that's really extremely high. If you remember from our discussion about northern industrial cities, in the North, it was extremely rare to have one ethnic group, even in a neighborhood, in say New York City, dominate a neighborhood with 60% or more people. So like, for example, a Little Italy in the Lower East Side of New York, or the Jewish areas in the Lower East Side of New York. It was very rare, even in those areas that get those nicknames like Chinatown or Little Italy, for the population of one ethnic group to be above 60%. And if you look out here, there are several areas, several big areas, where it's basically all American Indian. And that's because of the reservation setup that's designed here in Western America. And this leads to a lot of problems for American Indians, because it's stripping them of their way of life and kind of making an artificial life for them on these reservations that they really just doesn't fit as far as their way of life and their culture. And so they end up with a lot of problems. So we always talk about, in America, at least in modern day, they're pretty much ignored as far as minority groups that are struggling. But if you look here, this is showing you poverty rates as far as different ethnic groups and different racial groups. Native Americans are up there with the highest poverty rates in the country. So they're basically on par with black Americans here as far as the people who are living in poverty the most. Now, if you kind of break it down to children living in poverty, this one's a little bit hard for you guys to see, but the one all the way on your left, the tallest one, that's Native American. So over 40% of Native American children or American Indian children are living in what we would consider complete poverty here. And a lot of this has to do with the lack of available jobs on reservations. There's not industry there. It's very difficult to kind of get off the reservation and to find work. And so they're really stuck kind of in this horrible cycle of poverty. And for you guys, in period one, we did talk about this concept of rural poverty versus urban poverty. This is rural poverty, where they're out there on these reservations, and there just aren't any opportunities, and they can't find a job. It's hard for them, and so a lot of them are living in poverty. They end up with a lot of problems too. So overall, the poverty rate for Native Americans is close to, it depends on the numbers you look at. This one's a little bit different from the last one, but it's higher than the national average by a lot, almost double the national average, somewhere in the range of like high 20s to 30%. High school dropout rate is double the national average. Teen birth rate is higher than the national average. And so even though they're a group that's really not discussed that much, they're dealing with a lot of problems. Rampant, you have alcohol abuse on reservations, again, higher than the national average. Cigarette use, higher than the national average. Drug use, higher than the national average by a lot. And so there's clearly a problem here, and there's clearly a problem with this whole reservation system that was developed in the 1870s and 1880s, and is still with us today. So what was the situation here? What were they trying to do? Well, is it assimilation or Americanization? Really what we're dealing with here is a process of Americanization of the American Indians out in the West. And what they're going to try and do is the government will say we're trying to make them like the white settlers, who we're going to talk about later in the next screencast, the white settlers who are coming out with the Homestead Act and settling and getting pieces of land. That's what they're going to try and form these Native Americans into. And what that does is it kind of strips them away from their entire culture, because their culture is not based off of individual property and dividing up land and a farming-based society. It's just not. That's not who they are. And so you have this group who's involved in it, called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, trying to take care of this and trying to basically transform their way of life into the white way of life of a farming-based economy and land ownership, and just a totally different concept of how to use nature and how to integrate yourself with nature. And so this is similar to the Freedmen's Bureau that we were looking at in the South. It's just a different bureau, and this was an older one. This was started in the 1830s and 1840s, dealing with Andrew Jackson and his removal of the Indians for the first reservations. And so this just kind of gets revamped here in the 1870s and 1880s. Now, what did they do to try and Americanize these people? Well, what they do is they try and get to the younger generation of American Indians. And what they actually do is a lot of missionary schools, a lot of church-based schools. They're going to open up schools off of the reservations and bring these children away from the reservation to try and teach them American ways of life, American values. English is stressed, and they're going to be away from the reservation on purpose because it's a way to kind of mold them into the American mindset. And what they're trying to do here is trying to remake their mentality, have them lose their old culture, their old Indian ways of doing things, because, again, you have this social Darwinist attitude, this white man's burden attitude, that their culture is less than the American culture, and so they're going to try and remake them and Americanize them into the mold of the day. And this effort has some success with some individuals, but largely it's not as successful as they would have liked, because if you look now, obviously when we look now, the poverty rates and the way of life, and it just hasn't improved. And so this was one method that they tried to use to try and Americanize the Indians. Another one is they almost try, and they basically enforce that they have to use a farming-based economy. And that is not the way that the American Indians lived traditionally out in the Great Plains. If you look at the Great Plains, a nickname for the Great Plains out there, like the South Dakota, North Dakota, those big Great Plains states, it was called the American Serengeti. We had, our own great grassland out there, and so they used it just like you would in Africa or the Mongols would in Asia, as a farming-based, not a farming-based, but a hunting-based society, a hunting and herding-based society. And so, of course, the great animal that they're going to hunt is going to be the buffalo out there, and that's kind of how they rely. That's how they lived their lives, was using the buffalo, and the buffalo is sacred to the Native Americans out in the Great Plains. To see a contrast as far as when the white civilization and the railroad started coming out west, these are two famous paintings of the time of white people and Americans coming out west, and as they come out west, the buffalo is like this great spectacle, and these great buffalo herds. There was millions and millions of buffalo, and buffalo almost went extinct. there was only about 100, and by 1900 there was only 100 bison left because of things like this. What you see here are people shooting buffalo off of the trains, and what they would do is as they were going west, it was like a great sport to shoot these buffalo off the trains, and they would just leave the buffalo there and the carcasses to rot. It was just kind of like hunting for sport, and they almost went extinct. We had to repopulate the bison population, and actually the Bronx Zoo is largely responsible for most of the bison in the world today. And if you go out west now, we have a lot of bison out there in our great national parks like Yellowstone National Park, some of the big ones out there, and they were all pretty much repopulated from the Bronx Zoo. The Bronx Zoo took some of the remaining buffalo out of the wild and raised them in captivity and started to try and repopulate the area. And there was this great conservation movement at the time, thankfully to one of our great presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted to kind of preserve some of the great natural environment out west. Because, if you ever go out west, I highly recommend it. It's extremely beautiful. It's very different than in our environment, but it's got its own beauty and its own, great natural settings out there. Now, the last big thing that's going to kind of hurt as far as the Americanization process is going to be something passed called the Dawes Act. And this is a very significant act. What this did basically was on the reservations, it kind of mandated the tribes to move away from their communal-based society, their communal-based living. So even on the reservations, they're not going to kind of leave them alone and let them live the lifestyle that they want. So what it did was it divided up the reservation land into individual pieces of land, individual tracts. And so each family, kind of like a homestead, just like the Homestead Act would divide it up, each family would get their own land, and they weren't allowed basically to live their lifestyle of living it all together. Now, some of the significance here of the Dawes Act is the fact that when there was land left over, a lot of white Westerners were in favor of this because if the land was left over, was just technically on the reservation, it would go up for sale, and they would be able to buy it for a cheaper rate and kind of profit again off of the Indians. So they conquer their land and they put them on the reservations, and they enforce the Dawes Act, and they're going to sell off their land again. So it's just kind of like conquest after kicking them when they're down over and over and over again. And so Native Americans and kind of their plight in American history is one of the saddest plights in all of American history, I think. As far as opportunities today on the reservations, a reason that you see, if you ever go out west, a lot of times you'll see Indian reservations will have casinos and they make their own cigarettes. These are kind of the opportunities that they have to try and make some money. There's really not a lot of good opportunities out there on the reservations. And that's why you have extreme poverty. Some of the biggest pockets of poverty in our entire country are on the reservations out west. And so a lot of it stems from the federal Indian policy of this time period, the late 1870s. All right, everybody. There'll be one more screencast coming up this week. Hopefully you guys are starting to study. I haven't seen too many people looking at the review sheet or started their Castle Learning. So get on that. Like I told you, do not leave it till the last day. All right. Have a good day.